Do you know who I am? I can buy this entire restaurant and have you scrubbing the gutters before you even clock out. Maya lived a life dedicated to honest, simple work. As a server at the city's most prestigious high-end restaurant, she worked tirelessly, picking up long shifts on her feet to prepare for the arrival of her baby. To her colleagues, Maya was just a kind-hearted, hard-working woman with a gentle smile and a quiet demeanor. She never spoke about her luxurious past, her family, or the world she was married into. She preferred the clatter of silverware and the predictable rush of the dining room over the dangerous, high-stakes underworld of her husband's empire. No one knew that the quiet waitress in the crisp white shirt and black apron was the cherished wife of Jin-soo Kang, the most feared and ruthless Korean mafia boss in the city. Jin-soo had shielded her from his dark world, honoring her wish to experience normalcy and build an independent life away from the syndicate. But peace is fragile. When an entitled billionaire named Richard Sterling walked into Maya's dining room, used to getting his way through bullying and wealth, their worlds violently collided. Richard thought he was just putting a nobody in her place. He had no idea that by extending his heavy arm and laying a hand on Maya, he wasn't just breaking restaurant etiquette, he was signing his own destruction. Hello viewers, welcome back to the channel. Please like and subscribe, and turn on notifications for more amazing stories of ultimate karma. Now, let's get into the story. The warm lights in the dining room were dim, and the soft jazz never stopped. Maya adjusted the settings on a corner table with a practiced eye. Her lower back ached. Being heavily pregnant made 8-hour shifts much harder, but she never complained. The younger servers looked up to her. When a VIP guest complained or a kitchen order crashed, Maya was the calm center of the storm. She rubbed her swollen belly gently, taking a deep breath before stepping back onto the floor. They were fully booked, and every table was full. The clinking of crystal wine glasses and the low murmur of wealthy patrons provided a familiar, comforting rhythm to the evening. Maya balanced a heavy silver tray on one hand, her other hand resting gently on her swollen stomach as she navigated the narrow pathways between the velvet-lined booths. At 7 months pregnant, her feet throbbed with a dull ache, but she offered a warm, genuine smile to every guest she passed. She loved the honest exhaustion of a hard day's work. It felt real, a grounding escape from the untouchable, gilded cage of her husband's underworld empire. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the front of the restaurant swung open with a jarring thud, breaking the delicate atmosphere of the dining room. A cold gust of evening air swept through the entryway, followed immediately by Richard Sterling. Dressed in a sharply tailored dark luxury suit, his expensive wristwatch catching the ambient light, he marched past the front desk without a single glance at the hostess. 2 nervous business associates trailed behind him like shadows. Richard did not have a reservation, nor did he care. He was a man who purchased skylines and liquidated rival companies before his morning coffee. Waiting was a concept strictly reserved for the lower class. He stopped abruptly in the center of the main dining floor, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the prime VIP booth overlooking the city lights. The only problem was that a young couple was already seated there, quietly enjoying their dinner. "Clear that table," Richard barked at a young, nervous waiter who had the misfortune of standing nearby. His tense, booming voice easily cut through the soft jazz playing overhead. "I have a sudden craving for Wagyu, and I want that view. Move them now." The young waiter froze, his face draining of color. He stammered, trying desperately to explain that the restaurant was at full capacity and the VIP table was reserved months in advance. Richard's jaw tightened. He stepped aggressively into the young man's personal space, his dominant frame casting a dark, intimidating shadow over the terrified employee. Seeing the waiter shrinking under the billionaire's glare, Maya smoothed down her black apron and calmly stepped forward. Her protective instincts, usually reserved for her unborn child, flared instantly. She placed herself smoothly between Richard and the panicked staff member, her posture straight and her voice remarkably steady. "Good evening, sir," Maya said, offering a polite but uncompromising smile. "I apologize for the inconvenience, but that table is currently occupied. If you wouldn't mind waiting in our lounge, I would be happy to prepare the very next available booth for your party." Richard slowly turned his gaze down to her. He looked at her simple white shirt, her pregnant belly, and her calm, unwavering eyes. To a man who ruled boardrooms through fear, she was nothing more than an obstacle, a disposable servant daring to tell a king to wait. The air around them grew dangerously cold as a cruel sneer twisted across his face. The heavy silence that fell over the front of the restaurant was suffocating. Richard Sterling stared at Maya, his eyes narrowing with a toxic mixture of disbelief and absolute disdain. He stepped closer, invading her space until she could smell the sharp, expensive notes of his cologne. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating pitch. "I could buy this pathetic establishment right now and have you scrubbing the gutters before you even clock out." He reached into his tailored jacket, pulling out a sleek black card and slalling it onto the hostess stand. "Name your price. Bump whoever is sitting in that booth, or I will ensure you never work in this city again." Maya did not flinch. She kept one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly, her maternal instinct anchoring her against the rising tide of his hostility. She had witnessed true, terrifying power in the depths of her husband's world, and this man's loud, boastful wealth was nothing but a fragile facade. "Your money cannot buy a table that is already occupied, sir," Maya said, her voice clear and unwavering. "You will have to wait your turn, or you are welcome to leave." Richard's face flushed a deep, violent red. He was a king in his corporate empire, utterly unaccustomed to being denied, especially a working-class woman in a cheap apron. The veins in his neck bulged as his fragile ego shattered under her calm defiance. Without another word, Richard's arm pulled back. Maya instinctively turned her face away, her eyes shut tight as she braced herself, wrapping both arms firmly around her baby. The loud, sickening smack of his heavy hand striking her cheek cracked like a whip through the quiet dining room. The force of the blow snapped her head to the side, sending a hot, stinging pain radiating across her jaw. She stumbled back a step, barely catching her balance against a heavy wooden chair. The entire restaurant froze in pure horror. The soft jazz seemed to fade into a deafening silence. To Maya's left, a young waitress clamped both hands over her mouth, muffling a terrified gasp. Seated guests stopped mid-bite, their eyes wide with shock. No one could fathom that a grown man would violently strike a pregnant woman in public. Richard slowly lowered his extended arm, his chest heaving as he adjusted the cuffs of his luxury suit. A look of cruel, arrogant satisfaction settled on his tense face. But he missed the most dangerous detail in the room. Standing perfectly still in the dimly lit background was a slim, sharp-featured Korean man in an all-black suit. Jin-Soo Kang did not shout. He did not rush forward to intervene. He merely watched, his dark eyes calm, cold, and highly observant. As Maya caught her breath, Jin-Soo tilted his head slightly, having already silently decided the exact manner in which Richard Sterling's empire would burn. The stinging heat on Maya's cheek mirrored the burning betrayal that was about to unfold. Before any of the paralyzed patrons could utter a word of protest, the heavy mahogany doors of the kitchen burst open. The restaurant's general manager, an anxious man named Elias, rushed onto the floor. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting from the bright red mark blossoming on Maya's face to the furious, looming figure of Richard Sterling. Elias's face paled as he instantly recognized the billionaire. In a fraction of a second, the manager's moral compass evaporated, replaced entirely by the terrifying calculus of corporate survival. Ignoring his injured, pregnant employee completely, Elias practically threw himself forward, bowing his head in a posture of desperate submission. Mr. Sterling, I am so incredibly sorry, Elias pleaded, his voice trembling as he wrung his hands. Please accept my deepest apologies for this unacceptable disrespect. Let me fix this immediately. Maya stared at her boss in utter disbelief. Her jaw throbbed, but the sharp sting of betrayal cut far deeper. Elias had always praised her work ethic, yet here he was, turning his back on her to appease a violent tyrant with a thick wallet. Richard smirked, slowly adjusting his suit jacket as if brushing off lint. Your server was aggressive and wildly unprofessional, Richard lied smoothly, his voice dripping with venom. I was forced to defend myself. I want her gone, now. Rather than questioning the absurd claim or checking the security cameras, Elias nodded eagerly, his fear dictating his every move. He turned to Maya, his eyes cold and completely devoid of empathy. He pointed a shaking finger toward the exit. You are fired, Maya, effective immediately, Elias declared, loudly, ensuring the billionaire heard his strict obedience. Hand over your apron and leave this establishment. You have disgraced us. Maya opened her mouth, the sheer injustice of the moment threatening to break her stoic facade, but she swallowed her words. She looked around the dimly lit dining room. The wealthy guests quickly averted their eyes in shame, and the restaurant's security guards looked down at the polished floors, refusing to intervene. The terrifying power of a billionaire's dollar had silenced an entire room of witnesses. With trembling fingers, Maya reached behind her back and untied the strings of her black apron. She folded it deliberately, placing it on the hostess stand with quiet, unwavering dignity. She refused to let Richard see a single tear fall. Holding her head high, she placed a protective hand over her baby and began the agonizing walk toward the front exit. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors into the cool night air, Maya did not look back. She did not look toward the dark corner of the dining room where her husband, Jin-Soo Kang, remained standing in absolute lethal silence. The manager had just chosen his wealthy patron over basic humanity, completely unaware that he had just forfeited his own future. The freezing night air had bitten through Maya's thin jacket as she walked away from the restaurant, but the true chill didn't truly set in until the following morning. Determined to maintain her hard-won independence, she woke up early, printed a stack of resumes, and set out to find a new serving position. She was an exceptional waitress with a pristine track record. Surely, she thought, another high-end establishment would gladly hire her. She was dead wrong. At her first interview, the welcoming smile of a local bistro owner vanished the moment he read her name on the application. He nervously slid her resume back across the table, muttering a flimsy excuse about the position already being filled. At the second and third restaurants, the managers wouldn't even let her pass the lobby. The whisper network of the city's elite hospitality industry had moved with terrifying speed. Richard Sterling had made a few phone calls from his penthouse, and just like that, Maya's name was completely blacklisted. She was branded as a volatile liability. No one in the city dared to cross a billionaire with Sterling's vindictive reputation. Exhausted and fighting a rising tide of panic, Maya stopped at a neighborhood pharmacy to pick up her essential prenatal vitamins. When she slid her debit card into the machine, it beeped with a harsh, glaring decline. Assuming it was a bank error, she tried her only credit card, but the same terrifying message flashed across the screen. Stepping out of the line, she pulled out her phone and frantically opened her banking app. A bold red notification blocked her dashboard. Her accounts had been entirely frozen under a sudden, aggressive legal injunction. Richard's high-powered legal team had filed a massive, frivolous lawsuit against her for emotional distress and professional defamation, tying up every single dollar she had to her name. He didn't just want her fired, he wanted to completely erase her ability to survive. Heartbroken and physically drained, Maya walked the 2 miles back to her modest apartment, her feet aching with every step. But the billionaire's relentless wrath had beaten her there. Taped to the center of her wooden front door was a bright yellow notice of immediate eviction.
Richard had leveraged his massive corporate connections to pressure her landlord, ensuring the pregnant waitress would be thrown out onto the street before the weekend. Maya walked inside and sank onto the edge of her small couch, the sheer, suffocating weight of Richard's power pressing down on her chest. The apartment was completely dark and silent. She gently rested both hands on her swollen stomach, feeling a soft, fluttering kick from her baby. She had tried so desperately to build an honest, working-class life, to prove she could survive without the terrifying protection of her husband's syndicate. But as the shadows lengthened in her living room, Maya finally accepted a harsh reality. She could never fight a ruthless corporate giant with just a waitress's courage. The shadows in the small apartment seemed to deepen as Maya sat in the suffocating silence. She stared at the bright yellow eviction notice resting on the coffee table, the harsh reality of her situation finally breaking through her stubborn pride. She had wanted so desperately to protect her unborn child from the blood-stained legacy of the Kang syndicate, to prove that a quiet, honest life was possible. But Richard Sterling had systematically destroyed that life in less than 24 hours. A soft rustle drew her gaze toward the corner of the living room. Stepping seamlessly out from the darkness of the hallway was Jin-Soo Kang. He wore the same immaculately tailored black suit from the night before, his sharp features illuminated only by the faint amber glow of the street lamp outside. He had been there all along, a silent, lethal guardian, waiting patiently in the periphery of her broken world. Jin-Soo never intervened without her explicit consent. That was the sacred vow he had made when she begged for her independence. But as he looked at the faint, lingering bruise on his wife's cheek, his dark eyes burned with a cold, terrifying fury. Maya looked up at the man who commanded the city's most feared criminal empire. The wall she had painstakingly built between their two worlds finally crumbled. A single tear slipped down her face, not from fear, but from the overwhelming exhaustion of fighting a war she could never win alone. My job, my bank accounts, this apartment. He wants to erase us, Jin-Soo. Jin-Soo closed the distance between them with slow, measured steps. He knelt gracefully before the cheap fabric of her couch, reaching out to gently cup her uninjured cheek. His touch was incredibly tender, a jarring contrast to the ruthless, calculated violence he was known for. He rested his other hand over hers on her stomach, feeling the subtle movements of his unborn heir. You fought bravely, my love, Jin-Soo said, his voice a smooth, dangerous whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. The corporate world does not play by the rules of the righteous. Men like him only understand monsters. Maya looked into his touch, letting the protective warmth of his presence wash over her. The naive waitress who believed in fair play was gone, replaced by a fierce mother, ready to do whatever it took to shield her child. She looked deep into her husband's eyes, finally relinquishing her vow of peace and giving him the one thing he had been waiting for since the moment Richard Sterling raised his hand in that dining room. Destroy him, Maya commanded softly. A chilling, devastating smile touched the corners of Jin-Soo's mouth. He stood up, his posture shifting instantly from a devoted husband back into the terrifying kingpin of the city. He pulled a sleek black phone from his pocket, dialing a single digit. It is time, Jin-Soo spoke softly into the receiver. Burn his empire to the ground. Richard Sterling sat back in the plush velvet chair of his exclusive private club, swirling a glass of incredibly expensive scotch. He felt like an untouchable king. He had successfully crushed the defiant pregnant waitress who dared to embarrass him, proving once again that his wealth dictated the laws of reality in the city. To celebrate his effortless victory, he snapped his fingers at a passing attendant, holding out his heavy black credit card to order the most expensive bottle of champagne in the cellar. But when the nervous attendant returned a few moments later, the silver tray was empty. "I apologize, Mr. Sterling," the young man whispered, his eyes wide with fear, "but your card has been declined." Richard's face flushed with sudden indignant fury. He snatched the card back, ready to unleash a vicious tirade and have the club manager fired, but his phone suddenly vibrated against the mahogany table. Then it vibrated again, and again. Within seconds, the screen became a blinding waterfall of emergency alerts. Snatching the device up, his stomach dropped into a sudden, bottomless void. His flagship company's stock prices weren't just dipping, they were in an absolute catastrophic freefall, shedding billions in market value by the second. True panic clawing at his throat, Richard bypassed his domestic banking apps and frantically logged into his encrypted offshore accounts. These were his safety nets, the untouchable millions hidden away from the government and his rivals. As the secure dashboard loaded, the balance stared back at him in mocking digital red. 0. The money hadn't been legally frozen by a court. It had been systematically, flawlessly erased from existence. His phone began to ring endlessly. His top investors and board members were calling to pull their capital simultaneously. Desperate and hyperventilating, Richard looked across the opulent suite to his head of security, a heavily scarred ex-mercenary who had protected the billionaire for over a decade. He opened his mouth to bark in emergency order, but the massive bodyguard was already staring down at a new message on his own phone. The hardened mercenary's face, usually carved from solid stone, was completely drained of color. He looked like he had just looked directly into the eyes of the Grim Reaper. Without uttering a single word to his boss, the head of security turned on his heel and quickly walked out the heavy oak doors. Richard watched in stunned silence as the rest of his elite security detail instantly followed, abandoning their posts and fleeing into the night as if the building were on fire. They didn't even look back. Richard stood completely alone in the sprawling, silent suite. The crystal glass of scotch slipped from his numb fingers, shattering violently against the polished floor. His massive, powerful corporate empire had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. The terrifying truth finally settled like ice in his veins. The woman he had slapped wasn't just a waitress, and he was now entirely at the mercy of the unseen monster she had summoned. Panic propelled Richard out the back service exit of his exclusive club and into the cold, rain-slicked alleyway. His only thought was reaching the private airfield and fleeing the country before the invisible noose tightened completely. But as he sprinted toward his luxury sedan, the blinding glare of high beams pinned him against the brick wall. 3 sleek, pitch-black SUVs glided silently into the narrow alley, boxing him in with terrifying precision. Before Richard could scream, 4 men in immaculate dark suits stepped out of the vehicles. They moved with a chilling, synchronized efficiency, completely devoid of the chaotic violence Richard usually employed. They didn't draw weapons, they didn't need to. Rough hands seized his arms with the crushing grip of industrial vices. A heavy cloth bag was yanked over his head, plunging him into total, suffocating darkness as he was shoved roughly into the back of an SUV. The drive felt like an eternity of silent terror. When the vehicle finally halted, Richard was dragged outward and forced to his knees onto a freezing marble floor. The heavy bag was ripped away, and the sudden, harsh overhead lights burned his eyes. He was kneeling in the center of a cavernous, underground boardroom. Standing at the head of a massive obsidian table was the same sharp-featured Korean man he had briefly noticed in the restaurant shadows. Jin Soo-kang looked down at the trembling billionaire with eyes as cold and unforgiving as deep winter. Desperation clawing at his throat, Richard tried to summon the last pathetic shreds of his corporate armor. "My lawyers will destroy you," he shrieked, his voice cracking violently. "I know the mayor. You can't just kidnap Richard Sterling." Jinsu didn't blink. He simply reached out and slid a silver tablet across the polished table. It spun perfectly, stopping just inches from Richard's knees. On the glowing screen, crystal-clear security footage played on a loop. Richard raising his heavy arm and violently slapping the pregnant waitress. "You believed your wealth made you a god," Jinsu spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed through the cavernous room like a death sentence. "You thought you were crushing a nobody, but you struck the wife of the Kang syndicate." Richard's breath hitched, the blood draining completely from his face as the crushing gravity of his mistake finally hit him. Jinsu gestured slightly, and a man carrying a thick leather binder stepped out of the periphery. He dropped a stack of legal documents onto the floor in front of Richard, accompanied by a heavy silver pen. "Your offshore accounts are ashes. Now you will sign over your mansions, your remaining shares, and your corporate patents. Everything you own will be liquidated and transferred. You will leave this room with nothing but the clothes on your back, or you will not leave this room at all." Sobbing openly, the arrogant king of the city collapsed over the papers. With a violently shaking hand, Richard signed away his entire existence, reduced in minutes to the very lower class he had so ruthlessly despised. The relentless, freezing rain had washed away the last traces of Richard Sterling's arrogance. It had been exactly 1 week since he was stripped of his empire and dumped into the very gutters he once threatened to make Maya scrub. His bespoke luxury suit was now a shredded, mud-soaked rag, and his expensive leather shoes were falling apart at the seams. The city he once ruled from glass penthouses now ignored him entirely. His wealthy friends had immediately blocked his calls, and the authorities had laughed at his frantic claims of kidnapping, pointing to the ironclad, legally binding asset transfers he had personally signed. He was a ghost trapped in the body of a beggar. Driven by sheer, shivering desperation, Richard dragged his exhausted body to the towering wrought iron gates of the Kang family's private estate. He collapsed onto the wet cobblestones just as the heavy gates swung open, revealing a sleek, armored town car. As the vehicle glided to a halt, the rear door opened. Maya stepped out under the protective canopy of a black umbrella held by a silent guard. She was no longer the exhausted waitress in a cheap apron. Dressed in a stunning, elegant cashmere coat that draped beautifully over her pregnant frame, she radiated the untouchable, regal aura of a Mafia queen. She looked down at the broken, filthy man trembling at her designer boots. Richard scrambled forward, his bloody hands scraping against the pavement. He pressed his forehead to the freezing ground, weeping with loud, pathetic gasps. "Maya, please," he sobbed, completely ignoring the armed guard stepping forward to intercept him. "I'm so sorry. I was a monster. I was wrong to touch you. Please, just tell your husband to give me my life back. I'll do anything. I beg you." A few weeks ago, the gentle, working-class waitress might have felt a twinge of pity for a crying man. But that naive woman had died the moment Richard's hand struck her face, threatening her survival and her unborn child. Maya rested a protective, loving hand over her baby, feeling a profound, unyielding strength. She looked down at him with eyes as cold and deep as a winter ocean. "You are not sorry for what you did to me, Richard," Maya said, her voice perfectly calm and devoid of any mercy. "You are only sorry that you accidentally struck a woman whose family could fight back. If I were just a waitress, you would have watched me starve in the street without a second thought." Richard choked on his tears, reaching a trembling hand out toward the hem of her coat. "Please, I have nothing." "Then you finally know exactly how it feels." Without another word, she turned her back on the ruined billionaire. She stepped effortlessly back into the warm, secure luxury of the town car, leaving Richard completely alone to drown in the freezing rain.
As the town car's taillights disappeared into the rainy night, Richard remained crumpled on the freezing pavement, the very last of his hope washing down the storm drains. Before he could even force his shivering body to his feet, the dark street was suddenly bathed in the frantic, strobing glare of red and blue lights. The piercing wails of sirens shattered the quiet neighborhood as a fleet of black government SUVs and police cruisers swarmed the estate's perimeter, boxing him in from every direction. Armed federal agents spilled out onto the wet asphalt, their heavy boots splashing through the puddles as flashlights blinded him. While Richard had been starving in alleys, Jin-Soo Kang had methodically decrypted every hidden ledger, every instance of offshore tax evasion, and every illegal embezzlement scheme from Richard's former corporate empire, anonymously hand-delivering the airtight evidence directly to the FBI. Handcuffs snapped brutally around Richard's muddy wrists, cold and unyielding. As he was shoved into the back of a federal cruiser, the ruined billionaire finally understood that the Mafia boss hadn't just taken his wealth, he had ensured Richard would never see the sun as a free man again. Months later, that very same sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a sprawling, private VIP maternity suite. The room felt more like a five-star luxury retreat than a hospital, filled with the soft, rhythmic hum of state-of-the-art medical monitors and the scent of fresh flowers. Lying in the center of a pristine, comfortable bed, Maya looked down at the tiny, sleeping face of her newborn son. A tear of profound, overwhelming joy slipped down her cheek. She was no longer the exhausted, fiercely independent waitress fighting to survive in a corrupt world stacked against her. She was safe, enveloped in absolute, unbreakable peace. Standing quietly by the edge of the bed was Jin-Soo. He wore his customary dark, impeccably tailored suit, but the lethal, terrifying aura that usually surrounded him was entirely absent. As he reached down to gently stroke the baby's warm cheek, his dark eyes held nothing but boundless devotion. To ensure his wife and child had the safest place on earth to bring a new life into the world, Jin-Soo had quietly purchased the entire private hospital, filling the perimeter with his most trusted, silent guards. Maya leaned her head back against the plush pillows, letting out a long, contented breath as Jin-Soo pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. She did not have to run from her husband's reality anymore. Her naive belief that she had to endure the world's cruelty alone had been replaced by a fierce maternal wisdom. She could be a gentle, loving mother and a woman of profound peace, perfectly shielded by an untouchable empire. The storm had finally passed, ultimate justice had been served, and within the absolute safety of her husband's protective shadow, a beautiful new dawn had just begun. True power doesn't need to shout, and the most dangerous consequences often come from the quietest observers. Richard learned the hard way that wealth cannot buy you out of the ultimate karma, especially when you mistake a quiet, humble woman for a defenseless target and mess with the wrong family. If you loved seeing justice served in today's story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next thrilling tale. We want to hear from you. Do you think Richard's punishment was too harsh?
Or did the arrogant billionaire get exactly what he deserved? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.